that. And I've watched his channel a long time
Actually,
too.
just a moment.
Okay.
Yeah, we need to start again. I forgot to press the go live button on the stream. But anyway, hello and welcome, our beautiful audience. Welcome to Getting the Answers. Today, I'm Anavultus here with White Berckenhoff, my beautiful co-host. Our topic today is the American justice system. We were talking about how our justice system is formed, perhaps some things we can do to change it, and we had just brought up the idea of perhaps we should have invited the prosecutor, but he's not here right now. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think he would be he would be excellent for a topic like this for sure, as we were discussing earlier. But my first kind of major point about the justice system itself, and obviously it would probably be better to explain the process before I bring up this first point, but I feel like we're going to do that pretty soon. So I'll go ahead and kind of just introduce the point, but we can talk more details about it later. But simply, when average American thinks about the justice system, and when I say average American, I mean someone that has paid attention to the justice system, because I feel like a lot of people, at least in my experience, as I was mentioning before we started stream, it's a very easy topic to ignore if you choose to. You can either follow news about it or listen to podcasts or just not, and you never know anything about how the justice system works or the process of it or anything related to it. So the first kind of point I had with people who do follow the justice system, there seems to be a idea of trying to change the process of how it works, especially here in Texas, because Texas uses the approach or the idea of basically uh, putting you in a cage through incapacitation or rehabilitation, I believe it's called. And
You're cutting out a bit.
focus on trying to change the person. We just want to charge you for your crime and you do your time. And that's pretty much it. So there seems to be an idea, especially here and other states, of trying to make the justice system a little less or a little more gentle, I guess would be the proper term.
Yes, I understand that. That has been a trend, historically speaking, because it used to be back in the day, you could get a death penalty for pretty much any felony. But that changed. The system softened up. People focused a bit more on rehabilitation or the penitentiary system, wherein the idea was that people, through isolation from society, would have a change of heart over time and could be rehabilitated through harsh conditions. However, I think it has been shown that sometimes this is not the case. The prospect of prison does not necessarily discourage a lot of prisoners in the fact that we see a lot of repeat offenders, and we also see prisons as a sort of social center for a lot of criminal organizations. There's a lot of gangs that operate in various areas that are primarily organized through prisons, not the actual organization of the prison, but the inmates in the prison organize gangs inside the prison, and then when they get out, those gangs operate outside of the prison, and then through repeat offenses, people go in and out, in and out, and the prison is a sort of social center for recruitment for a lot of gangs. So in that sense, on the criminal law side of things, in the way we handle prisoners, there certainly is a way in which that is a negative element. And people also from other countries like to point out that the US has a very high percentage of its own population in prison compared to a lot of other countries, which I think is a very interesting statistic. I'm not saying that that's necessarily good or bad, but I am saying that it could be an indication that there might be a problem. And of course, other countries handle the way in which they deal with prisoners in various different ways. And while the US is decentralized in some ways, through the Constitution, there are some guarantees that citizens in the U.S. have on how they are treated in criminal prosecutions. They have various rights like habeas corpus, the right to trial by jury, etc., and the right to not have unreasonable search and seizure and such things. So, and those things are applicable in all jurisdictions of the United States, although people point out that through various executive actions, there are usually some exceptions and loopholes in some of these areas. Um, but that's generally how things work.
Yes, for sure. And I'll quickly mention this YouTuber that I found probably a couple months ago. His name's Larry Lawton, and he was a former jewel thief and prisoner. And his YouTube channel is really good if you want to get like the inside of prison and his experience. And the reason I kind of bring that up mostly is when you said about gangs, because he has several YouTube episodes, I guess you could say, where he talks about kind of prison gangs and the idea, basically what you just said, that once these people get released onto the streets, they still kind of have the same behavior because they introduce themselves into the gang. And he even said a lot of times people aren't even in a gang and then they join a prison and they become a gang member because it gives them safety or whatever their reasons might be. And then when they get out of prison, if they do, they still kind of have the same behavior. So I thought that was a interesting thing, and I highly recommend his channel if you want more insight into that in particular. But another big thing that I see related to prisons and what you were mentioning as well is the factor of, since we have such a large prison population here in the United States, we've had to rely, or some say we've had to rely on private prisons or prisons that aren't necessarily super good, or old prisons. Like in Texas, there's several examples of prisons not having air conditioning, and Texas was in a lawsuit recently. I think they actually still are, if I'm not mistaken, over one of their prisons not having air conditioning in the time of summer, where in the prison it's access heats of like 113 or so degrees inside the prison, if not more. So obviously that can lead to several problems when you have such a large prison population.
Yes, yes, that is a true problem, and I would say that a number of different solutions have been proposed. People are talking about reducing penalties for certain crimes to reduce prison population. However, the problem that I have with that is that if you reduce the penalties for these crimes, then I don't think it still has the same deterring factor. So I'm not on the side of reducing penalties. I'm in favor more of switching the penalties to be a different type of penalty, in the sense that the penitentiary system, which developed um, in modern times, because if you go to the Middle Ages and to ancient times, they didn't have large prisons full of people with multiple year sentences. What happened was you got jailed until you went to trial, or you might be released, and then go to trial. And then after that, you would have a number of different potential penalties. One could be the death penalty. In some areas, they had corporal punishment of various sorts. And people might have to pay back a large fine, or people might have to do labor in order to make up for their crime. And through the system, through the institution of penal labor, which operated as a type of slavery in those days, there was essentially no need to have large places to incarcerate people, because instead of going into a prison where you're living in the prison, people would instead go out and work for a period of time and also contribute to the economy. And while I understand in some prisons there is an economic contribution by prisoners, in many prisons it isn't that way.
Yes. Uh, Obviously, I don't think we did it perfect when it was times of not having like a physical justice system, like you were, I think, explaining there, where it was basically just up to the two people. I remember one time in high school, my teacher was talking about this concept and was basically mentioning that, well, if, Robert stole your horse and you thought he did, and Robert said he didn't, it was up to you two to figure it out. And since it was up to you two to figure it out and you had the gun on you, you went ahead and shot him because you thought he stole your horse. And he says, obviously, there's something wrong with that type of justice. And maybe you're not going that far back in what you were explaining.
Yeah,
But
I'm not
obviously, I
talking
think,
about that because courts have
yeah, no,
existed for thousands of
hundreds of
years.
years. Yeah, yeah, right, right,
Yeah, people would go to court in those days.
right,
Now, of course, there were frontier justice lynchings, and I don't think those are proper either, because
right.
I have a standard of you need evidence, multiple witnesses, either persons or material witnesses, to prove that a crime occurred and that the person being accused is the one that committed the crime.
Right, right. So obviously there has to be some structure on how the justice system is done, and that's kind of what you're talking about with the courts there. And also one thing that, in general, I agree with you for sure. The only counter I would give, and I'll explain it first, but the idea of lowering the sentence time or the amount you have to serve, I think in general isn't necessarily like you were saying going to make the criminal not do the crime. I don't think that that's really going to change anything. Could it reduce the number of people in prison at a time? Maybe, but if it encourages prisoners to do that crime because it's less time, then you're running into the same problem. But the only counter I give, and it's not maybe necessarily related to it, but the idea of the nonviolent drug offenders, because most of the time when you listen to these podcast people or read articles, that's what they talk about. Because they say the majority of our prisons have drug offenders that were nonviolent, blah, 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 blah. If we get rid of those prisoners, our prison population goes down. Should we reduce the prison sentence for nonviolent drug offenders?
Yeah, well, an alternative would be to raise the sentence to a death penalty, which would, I would imagine, highly discourage people from making drug offenses. But I don't think that that's necessarily practical, though. So, in my view, we need to come to a decision on whether or not these things should be allowed or that they should not be allowed. And if they should be allowed, then we decriminalize and legalize. If they should not be allowed, then we impose harsh penalties. And if the penalties are not severe enough, and we still have a huge problem, then we have to impose even more severe penalties. So it's a question on whether or not the law is going to tolerate these actions or whether the law is going to be intolerant of these actions. And then an escalation follows, wherein either in the cost benefit analysis, you reach a point where the penalties are high enough that it does not become a common crime, or you escalate to the point that you have to implement the death penalty. That is, if you are sure that this is not something that we should allow. Now, that being said, the usage of, for example, drugs, various drugs, is a controversial issue that there are many different positions upon on multiple parties. So, in that sense, in my view, it would make sense to perhaps decentralize the justice system on that area, so that rather than having the whole country operate on a single system on which drugs are legal or illegal, we have a more decentralized system where in some areas it's okay, in some areas you need a doctor's permission, in some areas It's a crime that you might have to pay a fine. In some areas, you might have to go to prison, and in some areas, you get hanged. And it all depends on how much the community wants to avoid this type of behavior.
Right, I definitely see what you're saying. And real quick, those who may not know or just need a refresher, you obviously have different types of prisons. You have your federal prisons, you have your state prisons, and then you have like your county jails and whatnot. And they're all run slightly different because federal prisons are operated at a federal level, state prisons are operated at the state level. You get it. So not all prisons are the same when it comes to that. Just thought I would throw that out real quick, just in case. But to what you were saying, in general, as I'm leaning more and more libertarian as I think about politics and news and whatever comes to it, the more I favor a decentralized system like you were just saying, because I do think that it should be up to the community and not necessarily up to, the entire government as a whole, because I just think that that leads to better results. So I have nothing really to necessarily argue on that point. The only thing that I could kind of counter would be, would that only be state prisons? Because I don't think you would ever be able to decentralize a federal system or federal prison. So I don't necessarily see that particularly working. But I could definitely see maybe at like a state level how something like that could form.
Yeah, essentially you would have to go on the federal level and say we're not going to deal with these things anymore. We're going to let other people deal with them, and that would have to be either on the state level, on the county level, or even on the municipal level, which is what I would prefer. Now, that being said, I still do favor people having the ability to ban these types of offenses to the fullest degree, even up to the death penalty, because I think that if people are going to have a community, a more tight knit community, they'll probably be able to better determine what is good and what is bad for the community, and they will be able to more easily understand the impact of punishment of crimes within their community. Now, that being said, if they still want to contract jails, I think they should be allowed to do that. If they want to have government funded jails, I think they should be allowed to do that too. So we could go a number of different directions on this, but what I think is important is the idea of having options in how to do this, because that allows for flexibility that adjusts for different situations. Because the drug situation in Texas is probably a lot different from the drug situation in Montana.
Yeah, for
So,
sure, for sure.
so the way in which this is handled should go in different ways. However, I will also say that it is very important in the sense of political legitimacy for the government to not uh, enter into a position where they essentially take too much blame onto themselves for a particularly bad action, or well, not necessarily a bad action, but for a mistaken policy. And this is for the reason that if people have this idea that they can pressure the government into changing its policies rather than going through ordinary legal processes, then it erodes the legitimacy of the government. So, in that sense, I think that if the government, the central government, is going to get rid of various penalties, it should ensure that the public does not get the impression that this is due to a public support of getting rid of these policies, but rather that it is a decision made in the government by the people that were elected by the people. And this helps maintain the legitimacy of a political system. And one way to ensure that this idea is carried across is to have a zero tolerance period in between, in the transition. So let's say the penalty is at a certain level now, and you're going to get the penalty to zero at some point. So what you do is you have a brief period where you raise the penalty before you lower it. And I think that that's something that would be, in my view, a strategy that could preserve political legitimacy for the government in face of popular pressures.
Hmm. Yeah, I could definitely see what you're talking about there, and this was towards the beginning of what you're saying, but you'd be surprised just how popular the death penalty is on a lot of states. For example, California has the most amount of people on death row, but they don't really kill the people on death row because it costs too much money. Because all their appeals they have to go through and whatnot. And Texas is obviously the famous state that kills the most people per year on their death row. So,
Yeah, and
but both of those states actually have high support for the death penalty.
yeah, and this is another problem. The legal process in regards to the way the death penalty works is not as streamlined as it should be. It's not as efficient as it could be. It is unreasonably expensive
Hmm.
because, in theory, the a very cheap way to kill someone would be, and this is a hypothetical. I'm telling YouTube, I'm just
In
making a
Minecraft.
hypothetical here. Uh, if you were to pinch someone's carotids until they pass out and then slit their throat with a knife, and then they bleed out and they die, and it's painless because they're passed out, and you've cut off circulation to the brain, and then you've desanguinated, and therefore circulation can't return to the brain. So it's a relatively painless way to die. Now, obviously, in the sense of an execution, that's probably not the most procedurally safe way to carry out an execution. So that's why people do hangings, where there's been centuries of study and techniques on how to perform a clean hang and how much rope you need, how far they need to drop, uh, etc. This is a science. Uh, so if you get a sturdy rope and a good gallows, you can hang people all day long at a relatively low cost, and of course it costs the rope. Or if you want to get even more efficient, I would say a guillotine is possibly cheaper in the long term. All you need to do is ensure that the blade remains sharp, the mechanism is well lubricated so that it falls cleanly. Although on the blood side of things, it is a bit messy. So in that sense, that's the drawback to that method. But I think lethal injection is
Hmm.
extremely expensive, especially considering that countries that produce chemical compounds that the U.S. uses in lethal injections have refused to export those chemical compounds to the U.S., which has raised the cost of lethal injection. Uh, Also, lethal injection is not as foolproof a way as decapitation or the clean hang. So, in that sense, I think that lethal injection is unreasonably expensive. It requires a high level of medical expertise to carry out correctly. And ultimately, in my view, I don't think it is the most cost effective way that we could do this. So, what I'm saying is, we should move to ways that are cheaper, that are very consistent, and that have few places where they can go wrong. And in that sense, we would save a lot of money. We would be able to streamline the execution process and do that. Now, a lot of people are against the death penalty for reason of, what if there are innocents? What if there is an innocent person that goes onto death row and that is killed, and then we find out that this person was innocent all along, this person has been exonerated, and now we've killed an innocent person in the legal system? What do you say about that?
That's one of the strongest arguments against the death penalty for sure. Uh, I guess I would say my short summary of what I think about that idea is I'm for the death penalty myself. I would say more than I'm against the death penalty. And I don't think it should be used for some crimes and others, but we that's a whole separate topic too. But in general, I would say to those people that argue that point, I definitely see where they're coming from, but you also have to take the other side of the coin or the other side of the perspective and say like how many of innocents have we killed? Now obviously that sounds very harsh to think that well you don't really care about those innocent lives, but tend to look at the overall justice system itself and not just at individual cases because obviously we're all human and we're not going to have a perfect justice system. So I'm trying to look at the whole concept and not just one or two examples. Now, if there's one or two examples become the majority, then we start to have a major problem with the concept of the death penalty. But it's just not what it is right now.
Yeah. My view is that ideally the death penalty is carried out within a week of conviction. And of course, to do this, you would have to, because a lot of times people are exonerated sometimes months or years after because of new evidence that is found, which might not be found immediately after the time of conviction. Now, the reason for this, the reason why I think it should ideally be within a week of conviction, is so that the legal process is streamlined. We're clearing up our jails. We don't have people in prison for years on end waiting to die. And we have confidence in our legal system that we correctly convicted someone. So essentially, what we need to have is confidence that our conviction is correct. And if our current system lacks the ability to provide us with that confidence, then we must reform our system so that we can regain that confidence. Because if we don't have confidence that the people that we are convicting are guilty, then we don't really have a useful legal system.
Yes, I have a question, but I'm going to state this first. When you're talking about the cost it has for someone on death row, I was trying to remember the numbers, and I can look it up here in a bit. I just want to get this point out. It costs a lot of money to keep those people on death row. And then when you talk about the legal process, and this is why there's not many deaths in California, it's because it costs so much money legally to kill that person because of how many pills they have. And the reason Texas kills as many people as it does is because they're only allowed one a pill in their process of the death row. So it makes it a little bit faster, uh, but still a very long process compared to what you're kind of saying with your 1 week system, which I can see potentially some flaws too, but it ultimately goes back to your question of confidence for the justice system. Because right now, I don't really think that people are confident in the justice system, at least those that pay attention to it. And this brings me to my question. Do you think that starts from the court systems itself, or do you think it's going all the way down to like the police, that people no longer trust the police to make an accurate arrest of somebody?
Well, with the police, of course, there is the idea of gathering evidence and gaining confessions, etc. A lot of confessions that happen in courts were done or acquired through police assistance. So, in that sense, sometimes the police is overly eager to gain confessions of people, and that would be something that would be a problem on the police side if the police is forcing people to give false confessions. In that case, I think that there should be a much stronger legal culpability on the police if they are garnering false confessions, because that would essentially be a form of, in my view, it should be classified as a form of perjury of some sort, um, or or at least their incitement to perjury. If a police encourages someone to give a confession which is inaccurate, and that should be uh, that should be something that's legally actionable. That should be something that policemen should be able to get punished over. So, in that sense, in my view, police should be culpable for various crimes that they commit. I think that there is a problem in some areas that police are given free passes on various things, and on the way in which courts treat police testimony uh, as opposed to the testimony of other witnesses. The courts tend to have a high reliability on police testimony as opposed to that of other witnesses, which leads to a status wherein some testimony is superior to others. However, in the context of a court, we need to be able to separate the court from the police as an institution, and therefore it, in my view, shouldn't have that high of a preference. Now, if a policeman witnesses a crime, I think the policeman is a valid witness. If a policeman witnesses someone giving a testimony of something, I think that is a valid witness. So, in that sense, I'm not saying that the courts should depreciate the value of police testimony, but I think that the courts should not hold it excessively above the testimony of other individuals. Now, in the courts themselves, there are a number of ways in which the courts could be considered unreliable in some ways. And that is partially due to the way in which trials work, where we in the US have a trial by jury, where we are asking a number of individuals who are not experts in the law to make decisions as to what should happen, whether someone is guilty or innocent on various counts. So, in that sense, I think that there are other systems that other countries use where they might have a panel of judges that do that instead. And I think, in my view, that's preferable. Now, I understand a lot of people love the idea of trial by jury, and in that sense, they have that preference. However, I would prefer to have experts making these judgments rather than average people. But that's just my preference on that.
Right. And just to give the number on what I said earlier, because I found it, according to the deathpenalty.org, it says that the average cost per year of an inmate on death row is about $90,000 per year.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of money when you talk about adding how many people are actually on death row.
Yeah.
And no, go on.
Yeah, and I think what matters most of all is the standards of evidence, wherein if someone is convicted, there should be legally documented evidence as part of the conviction. In other words, they should say, we are convicting this person for X, Y, Z reason. These are the witnesses, these are the material witnesses that to us prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was this person that took this action, which is this crime. I think that should be a legal requirement. And the problem is that currently the way it works, the prosecution makes a case, and if the jurors feel that they agree that it is a valid case, then they can simply vote yes based on sometimes circumstantial evidence. People are convicted. Evidence which is very minor, evidence which doesn't prove very much. It should be a requirement to have a logically coherent set of witnesses in the process of the sentencing that can then be examined by other courts who can then hold that court accountable in case that a mistake occurs. And I think that would be better than what we're currently doing.
Right. Eyewitness testimony is historically not the best type of evidence as well. And a lot of people get charged sometimes really based solely on eyewitness testimony. And then several years later, it comes out that it was a different person, blah, 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 and the person gets released, but was in prison for, 20 years or whatever. You see those stories every once in a while. Um, but to the second thing, what you're talking about, and I think you described it pretty well. But with criminal law, obviously the burden of proof is on the prosecution and really on the police to prove that they caught this person for whatever crime. And that sounds like a good system. Like I think that should be that way, because in several countries, it's the opposite, where the burden of proof is on the criminal in that case, and the criminal is guilty before innocence. And we have it the opposite. And you were like, okay, then add jury on there, and jury of your peers. So it's not experts. It's not people yeah, it's not experts. It's just random people, your own people you may have even seen before. Okay, add those 12 of those people and now have them decide. Like that sounds like a really good system. But then you get into the problems with having something like that, because people who are your peers can tend to be very emotional when deciding cases.
Yes.
And this is where it goes to what you were kind of saying. And prosecutions love to really turn that person on the other side into a really bad person. So it's very easy to agree with good, which is the prosecution, than it is with the evil, which may not even be the evil on the other side. And then going to about your idea about experts, I don't necessarily see anything wrong per se with having experts decide on if the person is guilty or not. The only thing that I could eventually see, and it's similar to judges, especially judges that get elected and not appointed, is the idea of corruption. Like, where are these people getting paid from? Who's going to hold them accountable? It's that idea. You would have to make sure that you keep the experts as pure as possible, because if they start to get corrupted, then you could have a real bad problem.
Yeah. But the way it currently works, the type of evidence that is considered sufficient is entirely up to the jury.
Mhm.
So, in theory, a prosecutor could make a simple rhetorical argument, and if that's persuasive to the jury, they could vote guilty based on a rhetorical argument without evidence being presented. Now, obviously, a district attorney would not be likely to press charges based on the idea, on a rhetorical argument that someone committed a crime. So, in that sense, that's unlikely to happen. However, of course, that brings up the district's attorney. District attorneys.
That's a whole separate argument there
Yeah,
too.
yeah. District attorneys, they choose essentially which crimes to prosecute, or which events to prosecute as crimes. I think that might be a better way to put it, because they're not proven to have been crimes until the court proves it. But this, of course, recently has led to problems in areas such as Seattle and Portland, where a lot of district attorneys were hesitant to prosecute individuals involved in various riots.
Hmm.
And so a lot of people would get arrested and no charges were pressed, so they were all released. And I don't think that that's necessarily the most effective way to run a legal system, that you essentially choose which reports of crimes to prosecute. I think that anytime a crime is reported, there should be an investigation of some kind. Not necessarily you get a warrant right away, but we should at least investigate whether it is a potential that someone committed a crime, and whether there's evidence, and that then there should legally be demanded prosecution for this on based on a law. That the law should say that if there is an accusation of a crime, there should legally be a prosecution, and if people put in frivolous claims, then they should get fined or perhaps punished more severely for making frivolous claims. And that
Would be the cost of doing something like that. Because I've heard several arguments of people saying that the reason they do that is because of cost reasons, and that they think they'll be able to win this case, but maybe not win this one, so they decide to just let it go so it saves, money or whatever. And maybe money shouldn't necessarily be a motive, but we would be I just stupid, I guess you could say, in not thinking that money does have a role to play.
yeah, yeah, money usually has a role to play everywhere, and I think if the courts, if the legislators don't want to have crimes be reported on everything all the time, if they're afraid that that would clog up the legal system, then they should perhaps relax the laws a bit in some areas.
Hmm. And also, making things more strict or adding more time, you see that as preventing criminals from doing a crime, right? Or at least reducing.
Well, what I'm talking about is the fact that there's a number of different areas where the government exercises a large amount of regulation or a large amount of uh, legislation in various areas. For example, the idea of structuring. That's a crime. Have you ever heard of structuring?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so hear this. If you take a certain amount of money and there's a certain amount of money that if you put it in a bank or take it out of a bank, the bank is required legally to report on that. Okay? So structuring happens when you take just below that amount and you take several transactions instead of the big transaction that would cause a report to be filed. So if you take several bank transactions uh, on that money, uh, and therefore no bank report is filed on the movement of that money, then that is considered to be a crime. It's called structuring. So libertarian type people might think, how could the way you move money around be a crime? But unfortunately, the government is so interested to know where you're moving large amounts of money that they've decided that if you don't let the government know that you're moving large amounts of money, the government is going to get very angry, and you can go to prison for moving large amounts of money without telling the government.
That's a little bit Big Brother, don't you think?
It is, it is. But I think that that's something that maybe if you wanted to go on the local level and the government for some reason has an interest in knowing where you're moving money, perhaps for tax purposes, maybe that would be fine. But the fact that it's on the higher levels of government that they want to know where all your money is, that's in my view a bit excessive. I don't think the government needs on that level needs to know that. Now, of course, I also think that taxation should be decentralized, and that levels of government should tax the levels below them rather than going all the way to taxing individuals directly. So, in that sense, that would make sense to me. But I think the central government declaring structuring to be a crime is, in my view, a problem.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a problem for sure. uh, I think there's several crimes in general that probably could be reduced or simply just put off the book. Like you always have that funny statistic that I hear occasionally of like, you commit X amount of felonies a day, and you're like, well, what did I do? Like, how did I commit that many, felonies? And then you might look at it and you go, like, yeah, why is this still, a law or still something I could be charged for? So it's like I feel like there's a lot of those things that could be reduced for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. There's a lot of laws that are very impractical, but that if, let's say, you did something that upset somebody very high up, they could send someone to prosecute you for one of these laws that no one's ever heard of. And the fact that this can happen to pretty much anyone in the country is, I think, a problem. I think laws should be, at least in our society, should be made in ways that are practicable, in ways that you can actually reasonably expect people to be able to follow the law.
You would think, yeah, you would think. It seems like the most practical implementation of what a law should be, I would think.
Yeah.
I guess the last question I had in my mind to ask you for this topic, and we talked a little bit about it, but I was just wanting to get like I guess a clear opinion on this. What is your thoughts on private prisons? If you
Private
know
prisons.
anything kind of
Okay.
private prisons yet.
Okay. So my view is that private prisons are fine so long as there is accountability for them. Okay. Now, personally, I'm against the idea of long term incarceration. I prefer uh, monetary and labor restitution. So, in that sense, I want people to pay back for the crimes they committed rather than go into prison for a long time. And especially the idea of solitary confinement, which is demonstrably bad for the mental health of people. Uh,
Mhm.
However, when it concerns, let's say, somebody says, we want a prison, and so they have a prison for long term incarceration, and they say, instead of having a government agency operate a prison, we're going to contract it out to a private company, and they do that. I think that's fine. Um, However, so long as they are accountable to the person, to well, not the person, the institution that has commissioned them, that would be the government, and that they are legally liable for damages that they commit in the same way that a public institution would be legally liable for damages.
Gotcha. Yeah, I have to. Yeah, I got what you're saying there for sure. Because I know one of the major ethical arguments of private prisons in general is that they're making money running these prisons, and a lot of people find that unethical to make money off of storing people, basically, if you want to call a prison storing people, which in a large way it kind of is. And I also want to quickly talk about your idea of shoot, I just forgot what the term is, but basically where you work instead of just simply stay in prison. Uh, I do very much like that idea because especially if you look at places where they simply just view prison like a storage facility, the rehabilitation rate or I think I said that wrong, but the rate of prisoners coming back to that prison is very high. And there's kind of two approaches that I see people talking about. One is what you were kind of mentioning, and the other is more trying to change the person in the prison system. So maybe they would still serve that, 15-year sentence, but it would be very focused on educating the person and maybe trying to get them a degree while in prison, blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
So you kind of have those two ideas.
Well, my idea is that if somebody goes to prison, they've probably committed a crime that probably caused significant amount of damages.
Mhm.
And in that sense, I would want the victim of the crime to receive back for the damages that they have received. So, in that sense, it's. I'm going to make a comparison here. For example, in the Bible, in the law, the Torah, there's laws about if somebody steals a sheep, then that person has to give back 4 times the amount or whatever. And,
Mhm.
and that might, I'm paraphrasing here. I'm not sure if that's exactly what it says.
Yeah, yeah, I
Uh,
get what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah, but it essentially has this idea that if somebody commits a crime, that person has to pay back for the crime and also pay back for the fact that they committed a crime as well. And because if you let's say somebody injures you, now there's obviously the cost of recovering from the injury, the medical fees associated with that, but there's also the cost of not being able to work while you're injured as well, the cost of perhaps having lost opportunities because of your injury, especially if it's a permanent injury. There's long-term costs associated with that. So in that under that idea, I think it is worthwhile to pay back someone for a crime multiple times over, not 100 times over. I think that's quite excessive, but a few times over uh, for the crime and for the lost opportunities, etc., that are caused by that. And I think getting that to the victims of a crime is, in my view, very important because that is where the damages are. Because the crime, as an action, is an action that was produced through the mind and the actions of the criminal, but the actual damage that was caused is not only the damage that the criminal did to himself by committing a crime, but it's the damage to the victim. And so we need to have a legal system that focuses on the victim and restoring the victim for the crime that has been committed to the victim. And the person responsible for this is the criminal by mechanism of the legal system. And to do this, you have to have them either pay back through fluidity, that is money, or pay back for labor. Now, I wouldn't say that he would have to directly work for the victim. We could have various companies contract on that. Since this is an economic activity, it would necessarily have to involve private agencies, of course.
Right, for sure. I was just looking this up to make sure I actually uh, am saying the right thing. But I know there's a type of justice system that focuses on the victim the perpetrator being the criminal, and then like the system itself, or the prison itself. And the idea is basically that there's two people who are at fault, or two people that need help, being the criminal for actually doing the crime, and the community for having the crime being done to it. So, according to this, it says restorative justice is a system using the victim and offender dialogue to address the harm caused by a crime, as well as victims' experiences, interests, and needs. Judges may consider reducing some offenses, sentences following restorative justice participation. So, that seems to me what you're kind of describing as a type of justice system.
Yeah, because if someone burns your house down, now you might have insurance, but the the cost of that and is not going to be restored by someone going to prison for 20 years.
Yes.
And I think if we advertise it in this way, this could actually be something that could be popular. The idea that if someone does something to you, they owe you for what they did to you.
Right. Yep. I mean, it's definitely better than what we have. Like, I don't think the system we have right now works for anybody, really, for that matter, because the rate of prisoners coming back is high. There doesn't really seem to be anything preventing criminals from doing the acts in the first place. It doesn't really seem to work for any party.
Yeah. So I think a couple of other concepts in regards to the justice system that we might talk about. Um, One is the idea of people who have been released from prison voting. What do you think about that?
That's a that's an interesting question. I guess if you want the short answer again, I would say that I necessarily I don't. I think it would depend on the person, and I don't think you could ever do a system where every prisoner who gets released is then able to vote, because I don't really think that there's gonna that would work particularly. But then I don't really think that you're really using the concept as what the question is. I think it's more everybody or nobody type of solution, really. So if I had to pick between everybody and nobody, I think that nobody might work a little bit better, just because you have prisoners who are mentally unstable that may in time be able to get released. And I don't. It's a hard concept to me to grasp, because I think there's a good amount of people who are in prison that are definitely educated enough and know the system and know politics a lot better than we do, because they're trying to get out of prison and trying to follow politics and know news and blah blah blah. There's a lot of prisoners that are probably smarter than the average American voter, but I don't think that that's everybody by any means.
Yes, my idea on this is that under an idea of rehabilitation, let's say if we assume that someone has been rehabilitated, then they would naturally be able to vote again. Okay, under another assumption, the assumption of the completeness of their punishment, that is to say, once they've served their time, or under a hypothetical labor restitution, once they've done that, or once they've paid the fine, that their interaction with the justice system for the crime is complete. Under that idea, then also they would be allowed to vote. So the idea under which they would not be allowed to vote would be the idea that they have become a criminal and will continue to be treated as a criminal even after they have accomplished the penalty that they have received, and even if they have rehabilitated.
Right, gotcha. So you're kind of case by case as well then on this question too.
So what I'm saying is the perspective people will have will depend on how they view the nature of penalties in the law and the penal system.
Right, right, gotcha.
Yeah. So the final idea I had is in the US there's different types of courts, many of which don't operate on the idea of trial by jury, and which have special ways under which they operate, where it might just be a single judge that makes all the decisions, as opposed to the regular system that most people know, which is the trial by jury system. And these courts exist for various different reasons and for various different purposes. Of course, there's military courts, which I think it makes sense to have military courts. So that's not really something that I'm criticizing here, but I'm talking about other types of courts that civilians might interact with that don't operate under a trial by jury system and that instead have a single judge. What do you think about that?
Uh, One of the examples that I think of is business courts. A lot of times have a separate type of process. So I think it's three judges, if I'm not mistaken, and they kind of decide on agreements between the two business parties. And a lot of people tend to think that that's favoring businesses or favoring corporations compared to the individual, John on the street or the individual, Karen or whatever you want to say. And I think that there is a lot of truth to that. I'll also agree with you that I think military courts are should be, military courts because there's a lot of military related terminology and things. And it would be hard to bring that to an actual jury that we think of today.
Yeah, especially if it has to do with events that require confidentiality.
Right, right, for sure, yeah. And another thing that just kind of comes to mind, which isn't exactly, I would say, a special court, but also the idea of civil law, being that it's like the Judge Judy type of thing, where it's just a one judge and then two regular people, trying to present their case. So it's not exactly related to your question, but I think it's very interesting to me that we have all of these different types of court systems when really Americans tend to only think of the one. And I think that there's advantages to having special types of courts because they might be more experts or the judges might have more, I guess you could say, smarts or legal smarts compared to just the average person when asking questions.
Yeah.
Because most of these courts are judge questions and not uh, like a argument, if that makes sense. Basically, the case evidence has already been presented, and they ask questions. A lot of times, that's example of a court as well. One of these types of courts as well. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is I think there's advantages and disadvantages to it, but I think that I like it more than I dislike.
Yeah. Another issue that I just thought of is, of course, the idea of case law itself as opposed to a statutory law. That is a common law system versus a civil law system.
Hmm.
In my view, I personally prefer a civil law system where courts can only make decisions based on laws that have been written, and that this also means that if a case comes up, it's very easy to look at the laws that are involved in the case because you can simply reference the laws, and then that means that the judges don't necessarily have to have the specific experience, and they only have to have expertise on the legal procedure rather than looking into uh, each individual law and knowing the way that case law operates and knowing the way case law has been argued. And this, I
Mhm.
would say, would solve the problem that you talked about courts existing because there might be special experience that is needed by judges in order to judge certain cases. Because if it's simply a question of this is the law and did these people follow the law or did they not follow the law, then in that sense that simplifies things and it allows, in my view, for a lot of these different courts to be simply merged into a general type of court that can deal with a wide array of issues.
Yeah, I definitely think it could be more efficient for sure. Um, I don't know how you would necessarily fix it. I do think your potential idea of fixing it is a lot smarter than what presently exists now. I just don't think if it would ever, ultimately reach that, reach it enough to change the types of courts we have. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Yeah, because what we see is, especially in judicial review, on laws that the Supreme Court deals with and how they relate to the U.S. Constitution, what we see is the defining of rights occurring by the courts in a progressive manner that leads you to a point where now people have certain rights that under the Constitution, under no reading of the Constitution, they could have, but it's because of uh, of decisions built upon decisions that the way in which the Constitution is exercised differs very much from the way it is written.
for sure, yeah, for sure. And you can even see that with just a basic, justice system, or what we've basically been talking about for the majority of the episode. Like the concept of it seems really good, but the implementation of the concept is sometimes not as good as it seems on paper.
Yep. So I think we can wrap up here. If there are any particular questions concerning the legal system, any particular topic that our audience would like for us to research more deeply, please feel free to leave comments in the comment section below so that we may understand what it is that you would like to get the answers to. So there you go.
Yes. And next week it'll be on my channel, the breakdown with Berkenoff for YouTube, and the breakdown with WB for Twitch and wherever else. And we're going to be doing it over the education system and trying to fix the process of what exists now.
Yeah. And feel free to continue looking at our older episodes on both my channel and his channel. I'd like to point out a bit of an announcement here. Pretty soon, we'll be having my book, Actionable Justice. I think it's somewhat relevant to the topic here, although it talks in a more general philosophical and ontological sense about what justice is, rather than looking into the specific mechanics of legal systems, although it certainly can be applied into legal systems. My book is now coming out, Actionable Justice Special Edition. And once that comes out, I will notify everyone where it is available to purchase. I'd just like to make that announcement.
Yeah, she got a self promo.
Yeah, I just thought it was relevant to the topic at hand, so I
No, no,
thought
it's good.
a good segue into there. So anyway, thank you all for watching, our beautiful audience. I hope that you're doing well. I hope that you are doing well economically as well, and I hope that you are doing well in the ways in which you interact with your system of justice. Okay.